Welcome back, everybody. In this video, we're going to look at an international case study that actually made a lot of headlines a few years ago. And it's one that I think a lot of people will be able to relate to and understand, but also it's a good one that helps us kind of project forward and ask core questions around ESG and what our responsibilities as a multinational company really should be. This case study is about Volkswagen, the very famous, very large international automotive company. Now we're going to start with a man named John German. Now John, at the time, liked to think of himself as just a simple engineer. As the U.S. co-lead of the International Council on Clean Transportation, or ICCT, which is a not-for-profit organization dedicated to reducing vehicle emissions, it was Mr. German's job to work with his colleagues to provide independent scientific data to environmental regulators on issues related to environmental, energy, and transportation policy. Well, in 2013, his team at the ICCT began investigating Volkswagen's diesel models. The reason? Well, they noticed there was a discrepancy in the nitrogen oxide and dioxide emissions between diesel cars in Europe and those in the United States, which has a more stringent emission standards. Now, what he said at the time was, we thought the cars in the US would be clean, and we could take the results to Europe and say, hey, look how clean they are in the US. Why can't you do this in Europe? But the ICCT team then commissioned the Center for Alternative Fuels, Engines, and Emissions at West Virginia University to do a standard emissions test on diesel cars in the United States. Now, among the 3 car models tested, 2 were Volkswagen cars, a VW Passat, and a Jetta. And the researchers at West Virginia University couldn't believe what they found. The Volkswagen cars were emitting 5 to 35 times the oxides of nitrogen permitted by regulators. Now, what enabled the discovery was perhaps how the cars were tested. Now, instead of the standard emission labs test, Mr. German asked the research team to run the cars on roads to simulate ordinary driving conditions. Now, if you're not familiar with how this works, an emissions test is often done in a stable environment without the car moving, and they test the emissions that come out of the car during that time. And they realized that maybe they should put those cars on the road in real driving conditions just to see if there was any difference in the output. And when the research team found extremely high emissions from the Volkswagen cars, their first reaction was that there was something wrong with their equipment. But when they realized that the test results from the BMW X5, which was the other car that they tested, were the same in both the lab conditions and when they ran the cars on the road, they realized that the fault wasn't with their equipment. Now, by then, Mr. German had already suspected the presence of a, quote, defeat device in the Volkswagen cars. But he decided to write up a report and send it along with the data compiled by his team to the California Air Resources Board, otherwise known as CARB or CARB, and the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, of the United States government. They did an investigation based on this information in 2014, and he also sent a, quote, courtesy copy of the report to Volkswagen. So then in December 2014, the EPA said that Volkswagen was using a software fix to solve the emissions issues in some of its cars. But when the California Resources Board tested the cars that Volkswagen claimed to have the fix in May 2015, it found that the emissions were still very high. Approximately 4 months later, on the 18th of September 2015, the EPA issued a notice of violation of the Clean Air Act to Volkswagen AG, Audi AG, and Volkswagen Group of America Inc., and alleged that Volkswagen had installed a software in its model year 2009 to 2015 2.0 liter diesel cars to circumvent EPA emissions standards. Now, according to the EPA, these cars emitted up to 40 times more pollution than was permitted by the emission standards. It was then that Volkswagen admitted that it did install what was called a defeat device in up to 11 million of its cars to cheat emissions regulations. Now, before we move on, it's just helpful to understand what emissions regulations, guidelines, and testing are really about. Now, as we know, transportation accounts for about 23% of energy-related carbon dioxide emissions globally. And as a result of that, countries around the world have specific regulations and guidelines about the types of emissions cars are allowed to emit into the atmosphere. And they have these different devices on cars to reduce the type of gases and other types of pollutants that are released. These are tested regularly to ensure that people are driving cars that fit within those regulations and guidelines. And if they're not living up to those standard regulations or guidelines, then both the owners of those vehicles and the manufacturers can have some significant negative repercussions. Okay, so back to the so-called defeat device that Volkswagen put into its diesel vehicles. Now, to call it a device is perhaps inappropriate, because it really was just a few lines of code amongst millions of other lines of code running inside the car's electric control module, which determined the car's driving conditions. Now, this is how the electric control module worked. By analyzing various factors such as the position of the steering, speed, and duration, and engine operation, and the barometric pressure, the control module could determine whether the car was being driven on a highway or on a road or being tested in a lab. Now, if the control module determined the car was not being tested, it would adjust operating functions like the frequency of fuel injection into the engine and the amount of exhaust to be passed through the engine's exhaust gas recirculation system. So as a result of that, the cars were able to release nitrous oxide emissions levels compliant with the EPA standards only when the module determined that they were being tested in that kind of lab situation. And the exhaust controls would be switched off if the module determined that the cars were being driven on roads. Now, the engineers who came up with this trick probably did not expect that Mr. German's team of researchers would be testing the cars outside of the lab. So to put it really simply, they created a system whereby these cars would, using software, they would effectively cheat the testing system. So on the afternoon of 18th September 2015, the phone of the West Virginia University researchers wouldn't stop ringing. The calls were from journalists from all over the world asking for details of their study. And before long, the researchers, like many others who watched the news, would learn that Volkswagen had admitted to using a defeat device in its diesel passenger cars. And in what was arguably the most expensive and largest scandal in the automotive industry ever, Volkswagen's CEO, Martin Winterkorn, was forced to resign before he was charged in the US with conspiracy and wire fraud. The company's former top emissions compliance manager for the United States, Oliver Schmidt, appeared before a U.S. judge in handcuffs, leg irons, and in an orange prison jumpsuit under the charge of fraud. And by late September, Volkswagen's stock price took a nosedive from 167 USD per share to 104, taking about 20 billion USD off of their market capitalization. Now, Michael Horn, the then CEO and president of Volkswagen Group in America, said, quote, "We've totally screwed up." Now, this Volkswagen scandal, commonly known as Dieselgate, eventually resulted in the company having to pay 34.69 billion US dollars, or around 31 billion euros, in fines and settlements. Now, this case made international headlines and is known throughout the world. But to see Dieselgate as purely an environmental scandal would be overlooking Volkswagen's problematic board governance structure and what some called a fear-driven dictatorial management style. Now, by the German Corporate Governance Code, all companies publicly listed in Germany are required to have a two-tier governance system. That means they have a supervisory board that makes strategic decisions and has the right to hire and fire management board members, and then below it, there's a management board that's led by the chief executive. Now, in compliance with the German code, the supervisory board needs to include non-executive directors appointed by the shareholders, and for companies with over 2,000 employees, elected representatives of its employees. Now, at the time, about half the seats on Volkswagen's 20-member supervisory board went to labor representatives, and the other half went to shareholders. And what differentiated Volkswagen's supervisory board from other companies is that 2 of its shareholder seats went to government representatives from the state of Lower Saxony, who was also part owner of the company intended to support workers. Now, this meant that labor representatives outnumbered shareholders on the supervisory board. And also, with only one board member being neither a shareholder nor an employee representative, the supervisory board faced a critical challenge. It was almost incapable of independent decision-making. Now, it was maybe partly because of this that a series of Volkswagen managers, including Winterkorn, ran the company with what was described as a, quote, fear-driven or even authoritarian style. Now, when Winterkorn became CEO in 2007, the company under his leadership announced its Strategy 2018, which focused on, quote, positioning the Volkswagen Group as a global economic and environmental leader among automobile manufacturers. Now, its goal was to, quote, increase unit sales from more than 10,000 million vehicles a year. Now, specifically for its US market, where its sales were lagging amidst increasing industry competition from companies like Toyota, who had a Prius hybrid, for example, Volkswagen planned to market its, quote, clean diesel engines to environmentally conscious customers. Now, the problem with these clean diesel campaign was that while diesel did indeed release fewer greenhouse gases like CO2 than petrol engines, it released other noxious gases like nitrogen oxides, which are harder to control and extremely harmful in high concentrations. Now, at Volkswagen, the engineers responsible for the design of the new EA189 engine for the clean diesel models were facing a challenge. The exhaust gas recirculation system would cause the particle filters to wear out prematurely. Now, while they didn't want customers to have to replace the filters frequently, they also didn't want to add additional emissions equipment. Being conscious of the tight time frame and budget constraints, the engineers resorted to what we now know as the defeat device. So who do you think should be responsible for this ESG disaster? Now, according to an analysis by The Guardian, the 11 million Volkswagen, quote, clean diesel cars may have contributed to an additional 1 million tons of air pollution every year. In addition to negative impacts on the environment, the emissions could also be responsible for harmful impacts on human health. And a few days after Volkswagen's admission of the installation of the defeat device on its cars, Winterkorn, their then CEO, said that the, quote, irregularities in the diesel engines were the result of, quote, terrible mistakes made by only a few. And he added that he was not aware of any wrongdoing on his part. But evidence presented at the trial of Oliver Schmidt, who was Volkswagen's former top emissions compliance manager for the United States, told a very different story. In July 2015, Winterkorn summoned Schmidt and a colleague to tackle a crisis. They just learned that the California Air Resources Board and the US EPA had refused to certify its 2016 diesel models until the car's NOx emissions met the regulatory standards. Now, at the meeting with Winterkorn, not only did Schmidt tell the CEO about the defeat device and the severe consequences that would result if regulators discovered the device, but Schmidt was also instructed by senior Volkswagen officials not to disclose the defeat device and the intention to cheat regulators when meeting with the California Air Resources Board. Now, let's imagine these two scenarios. One in which Winterkorn knew about the defeat device, and the other in which he didn't know. What does each scenario say about Volkswagen's governance practices? And what about the oversight necessary on the supervisory and management boards to prevent such kinds of scandals and societal and environmental harm? Now, after news broke of Volkswagen's admission of the fraudulent device, the automaker said that it had no obligation to disclose anything until US regulators issued a notice of violation in September 2015. Now again, what does this statement say about Volkswagen's social performance? In the summer of 2016, Volkswagen invited 9 individuals from diverse backgrounds to join the newly established Sustainability Council. Now, through the years since, the council has worked with Volkswagen's supervisory and management boards to drive shifts in their technology, their policy advocacy, corporate culture, and many other things. And in recent years, Volkswagen's C-suite executives have begun to take ESG more seriously, and the automaker's climate leadership has been acknowledged by the Science Based Targets initiative, an international group that determines best practices in the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. So Volkswagen's efforts have been noted, and we'll see what happens in the future in terms of their willingness to actually continue engaging in good ESG practices. So what do you think? When hearing about Dieselgate, either back 10 years ago when it occurred or now, were you surprised at what Volkswagen did and what you learned about their practice of hiding this information from the government? Secondly, what do you think should happen to companies or corporate officials who are found to actually be engaging in these types of practices? And perhaps most importantly for this program, what do you think can be done either within companies, within society, or even in terms of regulations and guidelines to hopefully ensure that these types of bad practices and illegal activities don't occur in the future?